There are places in history that should terrify us, not because of what happened there, but because of what didn't. When researchers at the Charleston Historical Society opened a sealed trunk in 1954, they expected to find routine plantation records, inventories, bills of sale, perhaps some personal letters. What they discovered instead was a collection of documents that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The papers told the story of Willowbrook Plantation in South Carolina, a property that operated for 43 years without a single recorded escape attempt. Not one. In an era when enslaved people risked everything for freedom, when the Underground Railroad carried thousands northward, when rebellion and flight were constants on every plantation in the South, Willowbrook stood as an impossible anomaly. The overseers never chained anyone. The dogs were never released. The patrols never had to search the swamps at night. For 4 decades, every enslaved person at Willowbrook stayed exactly where they were. The documents explained why. And once you understand the reason, you'll realize there are forms of imprisonment that have nothing to do with chains. The man who built Willowbrook arrived in South Carolina in 1797. His name was Thomas Vance, and he came from Maryland with enough money to purchase land, but not enough to be considered among the planter aristocracy. He was 32 years old, unmarried, and according to letters found in the trunk, he had very specific ideas about efficiency. In correspondence with his brother back in Maryland, Vance wrote extensively about his philosophy. He believed that traditional plantation management was wasteful, too much energy spent on discipline, too much money lost to runaways, too much time devoted to surveillance, too many resources consumed by the machinery of control itself. The overseers, the patrols, the dogs, the chains, the constant vigilance required to maintain order through force alone. Vance had spent 5 years working as a manager on his uncle's plantation in Maryland before coming south. During that time, he had kept detailed journals about what he observed. These journals were in the trunk, written in small, precise handwriting that filled page after page. He documented escape attempts, recording not just the fact of the attempt, but everything surrounding it. The circumstances, the punishments, the reactions of other enslaved workers, the costs involved in recapture and discipline. He noted patterns. He observed that traditional punishment often strengthened resolve rather than breaking it. A person whipped for defiance might be physically broken, but could become a symbol of resistance to others. A person locked in chains became a visible reminder that escape was possible, even if it failed. The machinery of control, Vance concluded, often reinforced the very behaviors it sought to eliminate. His brother's letters, also preserved in the trunk, showed increasing concern about Thomas's theories. In one letter from December 1796, his brother wrote, "Your observations are interesting from an academic perspective, but I worry you're overthinking the matter. The system works as it is. Discipline and vigilance have maintained order for generations. Your ideas about restructuring the fundamental approach seem unnecessary and potentially dangerous. Men are not mechanisms to be redesigned, Thomas. They are fallen creatures who require firm guidance and punishment when they stray. This has always been understood." But Vance was convinced he had identified a flaw in the entire system of plantation management. In his response, dated January 1797, he wrote, "You say the system works, but I say it barely functions. Yes, order is maintained, but at what cost? The constant expenditure of resources on control, the losses from runaways, the time devoted to surveillance, the danger to overseers and owners from resentment and resistance. We maintain order, but we do so inefficiently. I propose something different. Not harder control, but smarter control. Not more punishment, but more effective punishment. I believe it is possible to create conditions where people control themselves, where the desire for escape is not suppressed by force, but eliminated entirely. You think me ambitious, I think myself practical. Give me 5 years and a property of my own. I will prove my theories correct." That letter was dated just months before Vance purchased the land that would become Willowbrook. The property he selected was 1,500 acres along the Ashley River, about 20 miles from Charleston. The location was chosen carefully. The land itself was good for rice cultivation, with the right combination of river access and swampy terrain. But Vance had other considerations as well. In a journal entry from March 1797, he wrote, "The property must be isolated but not remote, close enough to markets that it remains economically viable, but far enough from other plantations that outside influences are minimized. The surrounding terrain should be difficult, swamp and dense forest that creates natural barriers. Water access is important, but the river must not be so easily navigable that it offers an obvious escape route. The property must feel like a contained world, separate from everything else." He found what he wanted and purchased it in April 1797 for $3,000. The previous owner had made a modest attempt at rice cultivation, but had given up after 2 years, finding the isolation and the difficulty of the swamp too challenging. For Vance, these were not obstacles but advantages. He spent the first month surveying every acre of the property, walking the boundaries, studying the terrain, making notes about sightlines and natural barriers. He hired a surveyor from Charleston, who later remarked to colleagues that Vance's interest in the property was unusual. Most planters cared about soil quality and water access. Vance asked questions about visibility, about how sound traveled across the open fields, about which areas of the property could be seen from which other areas. The surveyor noted in his records, "Mr. Vance appears to be planning something beyond simple agriculture." His questions suggested military concerns, as if he were designing a fortification rather than a farm. Construction began in May. Vance hired workers from Charleston, carpenters, masons, metal workers. The main house was built first, a modest 2-story structure that reflected Vance's practical nature. He was not interested in grandeur. The house was functional, nothing more. It had a clear view of the fields and, more importantly, a clear view of where the quarters would be built. But it was the quarters themselves that consumed most of Vance's attention and resources. The construction of the slave quarters took 6 months and cost more than the main house. This was extraordinary. Most planters built quarters as quickly and cheaply as possible, rough cabins thrown together with minimal materials. Vance's approach was different. The quarters at Willowbrook were designed in a square formation around a central courtyard. 4 long buildings formed the sides of the square, each building containing individual rooms barely large enough for sleeping. The buildings had windows, which was unusual, but the windows had no shutters or coverings of any kind. Inside and outside were fully visible from each other at all times. The doors to each room faced the central courtyard. There was no way to enter or exit a room without being in full view of everyone else. The courtyard itself was roughly 60 feet square, with hard-packed dirt and no trees or structures that would block sight lines. Everything was visible. Everything was exposed. But the most unusual feature was what Vance built in the center of the courtyard. Construction records listed it simply as circular structure, with detailed specifications for depth, diameter, and materials. The structure was a pit, 20 feet in diameter and 4 feet deep. The sides were smooth brick, impossible to climb. The bottom was lined with iron plates, bolted to a brick foundation. Below the plates was a chamber, accessible from outside the courtyard through a small tunnel. The chamber was designed to hold coal fires. Heat from the fires would conduct through the iron plates, turning the floor of the pit into a slowly heating surface. The pit was surrounded by an iron fence, 3 feet high, with spikes welded to the top at 4-inch intervals. The spikes angled inward and upward. You could step over the fence to get into the pit, but you could not step back out without impaling yourself on the spikes. The mason who built this structure was a free man of color named Benjamin Cooper, brought in from Charleston specifically for this project. Cooper kept his own records, and years later, after his death, his grandson donated those records to a historical society in Pennsylvania. Cooper's notes about Willowbrook were brief but disturbing. He wrote, "Mr. Vance supervised every detail of the circular pit. He tested the height of the fence multiple times, adjusting until the spikes were positioned such that a person could enter but not exit without injury. He experimented with the heating system, burning coal in the chamber below and measuring how long it took for the iron plates to reach various temperatures. He seemed to be calibrating something, though he would not explain what. When I asked the purpose of the structure, he said only that it was instructional. I completed the work as contracted, but I left that place with a heavy conscience. I had built something evil, though I did not yet understand the full extent of its purpose. By December 1797, construction was complete. Vance had spent nearly 8 months and most of his available capital building Willowbrook, but he had not yet planted a single crop or purchased a single enslaved worker. He spent that winter alone on the property, living in the main house, writing in his journals. He documented the weather, the patterns of sunlight, the sounds that carried across the empty fields. He tested the visibility from the main house to every corner of the quarters. He stood in the courtyard and confirmed that every door, every window, every inch of space within the quarters was visible from multiple angles. He walked the perimeter of the property repeatedly, timing how long it took to reach the main road, how long to reach the river, how long to traverse the swamp that bordered the western edge. In a journal entry from January 1798, Vance wrote, "The structure is complete. Now I must populate it carefully. The first group will be the most critical. They will set the tone for everything that follows. I must select people who are strong enough to work, but not so strong-willed that they will require excessive initial correction. I need individuals who are already somewhat broken, but not so broken that they are useless. People who have learned obedience, but still retain the capacity to hope. Because hope is necessary. Hope is what I will use against them." He spent February traveling to Charleston repeatedly, visiting slave markets and traders, asking his particular questions. The traders found him strange, but his money was good. He purchased his first group in March 1798, 12 people in total. The bills of sale were in the trunk, along with a separate document where Vance had recorded his own observations about each person he purchased. These observations were chillingly detailed. For each individual, he noted their approximate age, their physical condition, their skills, and most importantly, their psychological profile as he assessed it. He had interviewed each person extensively before purchase, something that was unusual but not unheard of. What was unusual was what he was assessing. For one man, identified in the records only as first purchase, male, approx 28 years, Vance noted, strong build, field experience, recently separated from family, sold to different owner, shows signs of grief but not anger. Grief is useful. It creates resignation. Anger would be problematic. This one will work hard to avoid further loss. He understands that resistance brings consequences not just to oneself, but to others. Suitable. For a woman identified as third purchase, female, approx 22 years, he wrote, quiet demeanor, housework experience described by seller as obedient and withdrawn. The withdrawn quality is important. She has already learned not to draw attention. She will adapt to the structure easily, suitable, and so on, through all 12 purchases. Vance was selecting for specific psychological characteristics. He wanted people who had already learned some obedience, who showed signs of understanding that resistance brought consequences, but who had not yet reached the point of complete brokenness where they would be unable to function. He needed people who still had enough sense of self to be capable of fear, because fear was the tool he would use, but not fear of physical pain alone, fear of something more subtle and more powerful. The 12 people arrived at Willowbrook in late March. Vance had hired an overseer, a man identified in the records only as Dutch. Dutch was not a typical overseer. Most overseers of that era were men who had experience with violence, who carried whips and weren't afraid to use them. Dutch was different. He was described by one visitor as a quiet man who spoke in measured tones and carried no weapon. Where he came from was unclear. Vance's records simply noted, hired Dutch, March 15, 1798, salary $400 per year plus room. This was a high salary for an overseer, suggesting Dutch had particular skills that Vance valued. What those skills were would become clear. The first weeks at Willowbrook were, by all accounts, ordinary. The 12 newly arrived people were assigned to their rooms in the quarters. The rooms were small, but not unusually so for slave quarters of that era. Each room had a simple bed, a small table, nothing else. The windows had no coverings, the doors had no locks. Vance assigned work tasks, clearing more land for cultivation, building fences, preparing fields for planting. Dutch supervised the work. There was no violence. No one was whipped or beaten. Work proceeded at a reasonable pace. Food was adequate. By the standards of plantation slavery, which were horrifically low, the conditions at Willowbrook in those first weeks would have seemed almost mild. But Vance was watching everything. In his journal entries from April 1798, he recorded observations. They are settling into the routine. Some speak to each other during rest periods. The women have begun to cook together when provisions are distributed. The men have started to establish informal hierarchies based on age and experience. This is normal. This is expected. I am allowing it for now. They need to form bonds with each other. Those bonds will become part of the mechanism. He was waiting for something, and in early May, it happened. One of the men, identified in Vance's records as Marcus, attempted to leave the property. The escape attempt was almost half-hearted. Marcus simply walked away from his work detail and headed toward the road. He was caught within 3 hours by Dutch, who had apparently been watching carefully. Marcus had not gotten far. The swamp and forest that surrounded the property were difficult to navigate, and Dutch seemed to know exactly where to look. Marcus was brought back to Willowbrook in the late afternoon. On any other plantation, what would have followed was predictable. Marcus would have been whipped, probably severely, perhaps branded, perhaps sold away as an example, but Vance did something different. Marcus was given food and water. His feet, which had been cut by the underbrush during his brief flight, were bandaged. He was told to rest in his room for the evening. No punishment was mentioned. This confused everyone, including Marcus. It was too lenient. It didn't make sense. The next morning, just after dawn, Dutch went through the quarters and called everyone out. All 12 people were instructed to assemble around the circular pit in the center of the courtyard. Most of them had not paid much attention to the pit before. It had just been a strange feature of a strange place. Now they gathered around it, confused and anxious. Vance was there, standing outside the courtyard, watching from a distance. Dutch stood beside the pit, and Marcus was brought out. What happened next was described in extraordinary detail in Vance's journals. He documented it like a scientific experiment, noting times, reactions, everything. Dutch explained to everyone assembled that Marcus had attempted to leave. This was against the rules. The rules were simple: work, obey, stay on the property. Marcus had broken the rules. Therefore, Marcus would be instructed. Everyone else would witness the instruction so they would understand what happened when rules were broken. Marcus was told to step over the fence and stand in the pit. He refused. Dutch did not force him. Dutch simply waited. The silence stretched out. Vance noted in his journal, "I had instructed Dutch to use patience. Force would make Marcus a victim. Choice would make him complicit." After approximately 10 minutes, Marcus asked what would happen if he refused. Dutch explained that if he refused, everyone else would be denied food for 3 days, and the instruction would still occur eventually, only it would be longer. This was the first introduction of collective consequence. Marcus stepped into the pit. Once Marcus was inside, standing on the iron plates at the bottom, Dutch signaled to 2 workers who were waiting near the tunnel entrance. They lit the coal fires in the chamber beneath the pit. Then everyone waited. For the first 30 minutes, nothing seemed to happen. The coal took time to heat. The iron plates took time to conduct that heat. Everyone stood around the pit in silence, watching Marcus, who stood in the center looking increasingly terrified as he realized what was going to happen. Vance noted, "The anticipation is part of the instruction. He knows it will get worse. He doesn't know how much worse. The uncertainty is valuable." After about 40 minutes, the plates began to warm noticeably. Marcus could feel the heat through his feet. He started to shift his weight, trying to minimize contact with any one spot. After an hour, the heat was significant. Marcus was moving constantly now, a terrible dance, lifting one foot and then the other, trying to find relief that didn't exist. He asked to be let out. Dutch said nothing. Everyone else watched in silence. After 90 minutes, Marcus was in obvious pain. The soles of his feet were burning. He couldn't stand still. He tried to hold on to the fence for support, but the iron fence was also heating from the sun and from proximity to the pit. He was trapped in a slowly intensifying cage of heat with no escape. Vance documented every detail. How long until Marcus started to cry? How long until he begged? How long until he stopped begging and just endured in silence? But what Vance focused on most was not Marcus's suffering. It was everyone else's reactions. He noted who looked away and who didn't. He noted who showed emotion and who tried to hide it. He noted which people seemed to understand the lesson immediately and which ones seemed confused or angry. He wrote, "The purpose is not Marcus's pain. The purpose is their understanding. They are learning that one person's choice creates suffering that everyone must witness. They are learning that they are bound together in a community of consequence. They are learning that attempting to escape means forcing everyone else to stand here and watch another human being tortured." Marcus remained in the pit for 6 hours. By the end, his feet were badly burned. When he was finally allowed out, he could barely walk. The burns would take weeks to heal, but Vance had already planned for this. He wrote in his journal, "The damage must be significant enough to be memorable, but not so severe that the person cannot eventually return to work. The body must recover. The body is valuable, but the mind must remain changed. That is the true goal." Marcus was given medical treatment of a sort. His feet were wrapped. He was given extra food to help healing. He was excused from work for 2 weeks. This confused everyone again. The punishment had been severe, but the aftercare was almost gentle. It sent a mixed message that was, according to Vance's journals, entirely intentional. He wrote, "They must understand that I am not cruel for cruelty's sake. I am establishing rules. Follow the rules and there is food, shelter, predictability. Break the rules and there are consequences, but even those consequences are measured and followed by recovery. I am creating a structure. Chaos and random violence would be counterproductive. They must believe the structure is rational, even if it is terrible." For several weeks after Marcus's punishment, life at Willowbrook returned to routine. The rice planting was completed. Work progressed. Dutch supervised calmly. No one else attempted to leave, but Vance noted changes in his journals. The people at Willowbrook were speaking less to each other. They avoided looking at the pit in the center of the courtyard. There was a new wariness in how they moved, as if they were constantly aware of being watched. Vance wrote, "The first stage is complete. They understand there are consequences. Now I will reinforce the structure through consistency." He implemented a system of rules that were written down and posted on a board near the courtyard. The rules were simple. Work assignments must be completed each day. No one leaves the property without permission. Everyone assembles when called. No violence among the workers. No damage to property. The rules were not particularly unusual. What was unusual was how Vance enforced them. Any violation of any rule resulted in time in the pit. The severity varied. Minor violations meant 1 hour. Major violations meant 6 or more. But every violation resulted in instruction, and every instruction required everyone else to witness. Over the next 2 years, the pit was used 17 times according to Vance's meticulous records. A woman named Hannah was caught taking extra food from the provisions store. 3 hours in the pit. A young man named Peter spoke back to Dutch when given an assignment. 2 hours. A woman named Ruth tried to sneak to the main house to see if there was any news of her child, who had been sold away before she was purchased by Vance. 4 hours. Each time, everyone assembled. Each time, everyone watched. Each time, the lesson was reinforced. Your actions have consequences that reach beyond yourself. Your choices create suffering that your community must witness. There is no privacy. There is no escape from the collective responsibility of being here together. But Vance was also implementing other elements of his system. He started keeping detailed records of what he called compliance metrics. Each person had a page in his ledger where he tracked daily behavior. The categories were unusual. Completion of assigned work, yes or no. Spoke unnecessarily, yes or no. Made eye contact with overseer, yes or no. Showed signs of independent thought, yes or no. That last category was particularly chilling. Vance defined independent thought as any behavior that suggested internal decision-making. Hesitating before following an instruction, choosing a different tool than the one suggested, singing while working, any action that implied the person was thinking about anything other than the immediate task they'd been assigned. Perfect compliance in all categories earned small rewards, an extra portion of food, a piece of fabric for clothing, occasionally a Sunday afternoon of rest. But the rewards were distributed publicly, and Vance noted in his journals that this too was part of the structure. He wrote, "When I give a reward for perfect compliance, everyone sees who earned it and who didn't. This creates internal pressure. They begin to police each other, to resent those who might jeopardize the group through non-compliance. I am making them partners in their own control." By 1800, the patterns were deeply established. The 12 original people at Willowbrook had adapted to the system in various ways. Some became perfectly compliant, following every rule exactly, speaking only when necessary, showing no signs of individual personality. Others maintained small sparks of self, but had learned to hide them carefully. A few seemed to exist in a middle state, going through the motions of work and obedience while keeping their internal lives carefully separate and hidden. But no one tried to escape. The pit sat in the center of the courtyard, sometimes going months without being used, but always there, always visible, a permanent reminder of what happened when you made choices that forced everyone else to witness suffering. Visitors to Willowbrook during this period left accounts of what they saw. Gerald Strauss, who owned the neighboring plantation, visited several times and wrote about Willowbrook in his diary. In an entry from June 1800, he wrote, "I visited Thomas again today to see how his methods are progressing. The productivity is impressive. His rice yield per acre is exceeding what most of us achieve, and with fewer workers. But the atmosphere is deeply strange. The people work efficiently and without complaint, but there is no life in them. On my plantation, for all its troubles and inefficiencies, there is still noise. Singing in the fields, conversation during rest, children playing. At Willowbrook, there is silence. Even the children, and there are now 3 born on the property, seem subdued. Thomas says this is proper discipline. I say it feels like death." Another visitor, a planter from Georgia named William Hartford, came to Willowbrook in 1801 specifically to learn about Vance's methods. Vance gave him a tour, showed him the quarters, explained the system. Hartford was initially impressed by the efficiency, but his enthusiasm waned as he spent more time on the property. In a letter to a colleague, Hartford wrote, "Vance has achieved something remarkable from a purely practical standpoint. His operation runs smoothly with minimal oversight. His workers are obedient and productive. His costs are lower than mine because he expends almost nothing on discipline infrastructure. No chains, no extensive overseer staff, no slave patrols. But I cannot recommend his methods. There is something unwholesome about the place. The workers are not people anymore. They are mechanisms." I asked one woman a simple question about her work, and she answered in a flat, emotionless tone while staring at the ground. She would not meet my eyes. She showed no personality whatsoever. When I mentioned this to Vance, he said it was exactly what he intended. He has created what he calls psychological efficiency. I call it the destruction of the human spirit. But despite these disturbed reactions, other planters were curious. Vance's productivity was undeniable. Several plantation owners attempted to replicate his system, building circular pits on their own properties. None succeeded. The mechanisms failed without the complete architecture Vance had created. The pit alone was not enough. What made Willowbrook work was the combination of visibility, collective responsibility, absolute consistency, and the psychological understanding that Vance brought to every detail. The pit was just one tool. The real control came from how he had structured everything else. The layout of the quarters, the rules about witnessing, the reward systems, the careful selection of workers, the consistency of consequences. In 1802, Vance purchased 10 more people to expand the operation. He was selective, as always, looking for particular psychological profiles. But now he had an advantage. The original 12 people at Willowbrook had been thoroughly adapted to the system. When new people arrived, they learned not from Vance or Dutch, but from the existing workers, who showed them how to move, how to work, how to stay silent, how to avoid attention. The system was becoming self-perpetuating. Vance noted in his journal, "The original group now functions as instructors for newcomers. They explain the rules, they demonstrate compliance, they warn about consequences. I barely need to do anything. They are managing themselves." One of the new arrivals in 1802 was a woman named Diane, purchased from a Charleston trader. Diane had been enslaved on a rice plantation 20 miles south and had attempted escape twice before being sold. Her previous owner sold her specifically because she was rebellious. Vance purchased her anyway, seeing her as a test of his system. He noted, "This one has a history of resistance. If the structure can adapt her, it can adapt anyone." For the first week, Diane seemed to be assessing the situation. She worked adequately but showed signs of what Vance called mental independence. She chose her own pace. She made eye contact with Dutch. She hummed quietly while working. Then one evening she asked one of the other women why everyone was so quiet. The woman, one of the original 12, looked terrified and walked away without answering. Diane tried asking others. No one would speak to her beyond the minimum necessary for work coordination. She was being isolated, not by Vance's orders, but by the group itself. They recognized that she was dangerous, not to the overseer, but to them, because her questions and her demeanor suggested she might do something that would require them all to witness another instruction in the pit. After 2 weeks, Diane tested the boundaries directly. During a midday rest period, she walked to the edge of the property as if to see how far she could go before being stopped. Dutch watched, but did nothing. She walked farther. Still nothing. She reached the tree line and stood there for several minutes, looking at the forest that represented potential escape. Then she walked back to the quarters. That evening, Dutch called everyone to assemble. Diane was told to step into the pit. She hadn't actually tried to escape, but she had demonstrated intention. The instruction lasted 4 hours. What happened to Diane over the following months was documented in Vance's journals with clinical precision. For the first weeks after her time in the pit, she was openly angry. She worked but radiated hostility. She wouldn't speak to anyone. She avoided eye contact with everyone, including the other workers. Vance noted, "She is in the resentment stage. This is normal. I will not push. The structure will work on her slowly." And it did. Without any additional punishment, without any particular pressure, Diane gradually changed. The anger faded. Her movements became more automatic. She started to show the same flat compliance that characterized everyone else. By 6 months after her arrival, she was indistinguishable from the others. She had been absorbed into the system completely. Vance wrote about this transformation with satisfaction. Diane arrived as a rebel and became compliant without excessive intervention. The key was patience and consistency. I did not break her through violence. The structure broke her through relentless predictability and the knowledge that any action she took would have consequences for everyone around her. She learned that she could not escape and could not even express her frustration without potentially causing harm to others. Eventually, the anger had nowhere to go. It turned inward and died. By 1805, Willowbrook held 30 people. The plantation was profitable. The rice harvests were good. Costs were low. Vance had achieved what he set out to prove. It was possible to run a plantation with minimal traditional control mechanisms. There were no chains at Willowbrook. There were no patrols. There were no dogs. Dutch supervised with quiet authority and rarely had to discipline anyone. The system ran itself. And still, in 7 years, there had been only that one initial escape attempt by Marcus. No one else had even tried. The psychological mechanisms were fully in place. The people at Willowbrook had learned absolute compliance, not because they were beaten into submission, but because Vance had created conditions where compliance was the only rational choice. Resistance meant suffering that everyone would witness. Even small violations meant public instruction that traumatized the entire community. There was no privacy, nowhere to hide, no way to plan or hope or dream without everyone else being aware. The visibility was total, the collective responsibility was crushing, and the predictability was absolute. Follow the rules and life was bearable, break them and consequences were certain. But Vance was beginning to notice something else, something he documented with increasing concern in his journals from this period. The people at Willowbrook were becoming too compliant. They worked efficiently, but they were losing something. In an entry from August 1805, he wrote, "I have observed a troubling trend. Several of the workers seem to be losing initiative even within their assigned tasks. They wait for explicit instructions before beginning work they have done hundreds of times. They no longer anticipate needs or solve small problems independently. They have become purely reactive, waiting to be told what to do in every situation. This is problematic. I wanted obedience, but I still need functional intelligence. I may have pushed the structure too far." He attempted small adjustments, trying to encourage some degree of independent thinking within the bounds of assigned tasks. Dutch was instructed to give less detailed directions to see if the workers would fill in the gaps themselves. Some did. Some simply stood waiting for more specific instructions. Vance noted, "There appears to be a spectrum of adaptation. Some have maintained enough mental flexibility to work independently when required. Others have become dependent on constant direction. I need to determine if this is a flaw in the system or simply natural variation in human capacity." The question haunted him for years. He had set out to create perfect obedience, but he was discovering that perfect obedience might be incompatible with the intelligence and initiative required for efficient work. It was a problem he never fully solved. Instead, he calibrated around it, identifying which people retained the ability to think independently within narrow bounds and assigning them more complex tasks, while relegating those who had become purely reactive to simple repetitive work. In 1806, something happened that tested the system in a new way. A woman named Sarah, who had been at Willowbrook since 1802, became pregnant. This was not unusual in itself. There were children at Willowbrook born on the property as a result of relationships between workers, but Sarah's pregnancy was different. She had become pregnant by Dutch. The relationship, if it could be called that, was clearly not consensual in any meaningful sense. Dutch held absolute power over everyone at Willowbrook, but Sarah had apparently believed or hoped that her connection to Dutch would give her some special status or protection. She was wrong. When the pregnancy became obvious, Dutch's behavior toward her did not change at all. He treated her exactly as he treated everyone else, with calm, detached authority. Sarah seemed devastated by this, and in her emotional state she did something unprecedented at Willowbrook. She confronted Dutch publicly during a work period, demanding that he acknowledge her and the coming child. This was a violation of multiple rules, speaking out of turn, disrupting work, showing emotional volatility. Dutch said nothing. He simply gestured toward the pit. Sarah's instruction lasted 5 hours, and she was pregnant. The cruelty was extraordinary, even by the standards of plantation slavery. Vance watched from the main house and recorded the event in his journal, but his notes showed conflict. He wrote, "Sarah's instruction was necessary to maintain the structure, but her condition makes this problematic. There is risk to the pregnancy, which represents economic loss. Yet to show leniency would undermine the consistency that makes the system function. I allowed the instruction to proceed, but I reduced it from the 6 hours I would normally assign for such a violation. This was a compromise that troubles me. The system should not require compromises. Sarah survived the instruction. The pregnancy survived. 3 months later, she gave birth to a daughter. Dutch never acknowledged paternity, and Vance never pushed the issue. The child was raised by Sarah in her room in the quarters, just like the other children born at Willowbrook. What this episode revealed was that even reproduction had been absorbed into Vance's system. Children born on the property grew up in the atmosphere of silence and visibility. They learned from birth that resistance had consequences, that privacy did not exist, that obedience was the only possible mode of existence. By the time they were old enough to work, usually around age 7 or 8, they were already perfectly adapted to the system. They had never known anything else. Vance found this fascinating and devoted several journal entries to observations about the children. He noted that they showed even less personality than the adults. They were quieter, more compliant, more completely absorbed into the structure. In an entry from 1808, he wrote, "The second generation is my greatest success. These children have no memory of anything different. They cannot imagine resistance because they have never seen it succeed or even occur with any frequency. They are being shaped from birth by the structure. This suggests that my system, if maintained long enough, could create multiple generations of perfect compliance. The implications are significant." But he also noted something troubling. The children seemed different in ways he couldn't quite articulate. They were too quiet. They didn't play the way children normally did. They mimicked work activities instead. They moved through the quarters like small ghosts, avoiding attention, avoiding noise, avoiding anything that might draw notice. Vance wrote, "They are adapting perhaps too well. They show no curiosity, no mischief, none of the qualities typical of children. They are becoming small adults who happen to be young. I am uncertain if this is the optimal outcome." By 1810, Willowbrook held 43 people, 28 adults and 15 children of various ages. The plantation was stable and profitable. Vance had achieved his goals. He had proven his theories correct. A plantation could be run with minimal traditional control mechanisms if the psychological structure was designed properly. His operating costs were lower than those of neighboring plantations. His escape rate was essentially zero. His productivity per worker was high. From a purely economic standpoint, Willowbrook was a success. But Vance was not satisfied. In his journals from this period, he began to question what he had created. The people at Willowbrook were obedient, but they were also hollow. The silence on the property had become oppressive even to him. In an entry from September 1810, he wrote, "I achieved what I set out to achieve, but now that I have achieved it, I find myself disturbed by the result. I walk through the quarters and see people moving through their days like shadows. They work, they eat, they sleep, but they do not live. There is no joy, no sorrow, no anger, no hope. They exist in a state of perfect resignation. This was my goal, yet now that I see it fully realized, I wonder if I have committed some error. Not a moral error. I'm comfortable with the economics of slavery and have no crisis of conscience about that. But a practical error. I wanted to eliminate the waste and inefficiency of resistance. I may have eliminated too much." Despite these private doubts, Vance continued to refine the system. He made small adjustments, trying to optimize the balance between compliance and functionality. He experimented with different reward structures, different work schedules, different methods of instruction. The pit remained the central mechanism of control, but it was used less frequently as the years went on. By 1815, it was rare for anyone to violate the rules. The structure had become so deeply internalized that external enforcement was barely necessary. New people purchased and brought to Willowbrook still went through an adjustment period. They would arrive with some sense of personality, some spark of defiance or hope or individuality. Within months, that spark would dim. Within a year, it would be gone. They would become indistinguishable from everyone else. Quiet, compliant, empty. The existing workers trained the new arrivals through example, through brief whispered warnings, through the shared knowledge that resistance brought consequences everyone had to witness. Vance barely had to do anything anymore. The system perpetuated itself. Gerald Strauss, the neighboring plantation owner, visited less and less frequently. In his diary entries from this period, he noted that Willowbrook made him profoundly uncomfortable. In an entry from 1816, he wrote, "I have not visited Thomas in over a year. I know I should maintain neighborly relations, but I find that place deeply disturbing. It functions perfectly, which is precisely what troubles me. There is no friction, no conflict, no evidence of human complexity. It is a machine populated by human-shaped mechanisms. Thomas has achieved what he wanted. I wish he had failed." But Vance had not failed, not yet. By 1820, Willowbrook had operated for 23 years without a significant escape attempt. 23 years. The records were clear. A few people had approached the boundaries of the property, as Diane had done early on. All had been caught before actually leaving, and had received instruction. After those early years, even the approaches to boundaries stopped. By 1820, no one even walked to the edge of the property anymore. They stayed in the areas where they worked and lived, never testing limits because they had internalized the certainty that limits existed and could not be crossed. The success should have satisfied Vance. Instead, he seemed increasingly troubled. His journal entries from the 1820s showed a man grappling with what he had created. He continued to document meticulously, but his observations took on a different tone. In an entry from 1822, he wrote, "I observe them, and I wonder what happens inside their minds. Do they still think? Do they still feel? Or have they become what they appear to be? Mechanisms that mimic human form, but lack human essence. I cannot ask them. Any question that invited them to reveal internal states would encourage exactly the kind of self-awareness I have spent decades suppressing. So I observe from a distance and wonder." He began to notice changes that worried him from a practical standpoint. The work was still being done, but it was taking longer. Tasks that should have been completed in a day were stretching into 2 days. When Dutch reported this, Vance went to observe directly. What he saw troubled him. The workers were moving more slowly. Not obviously, not in a way that suggested deliberate slowdown, but their movements had lost some quality of efficiency. They seemed to be going through motions rather than engaging with tasks. In an entry from 1823, he wrote, "They are becoming less present even in their work. I see them stand still for minutes at a time, holding tools, staring at nothing. When Dutch calls them to attention, they resume work immediately. But without constant supervision, they drift into stillness. It is as if the energy required to maintain consciousness is becoming too much for them." This was deeply troubling, because Vance's entire system was built on the premise that people would continue to function if compliance was total. He had assumed that removing resistance would increase efficiency. Instead, he was discovering that removing resistance might also remove the vitality necessary for sustained work. The people at Willowbrook were so compliant, so resigned, so thoroughly adapted to the structure that they were losing the basic drive to act at all. He tried various interventions. He reduced working hours, thinking perhaps they were exhausted. No improvement. He increased food provisions, thinking perhaps they were malnourished. No improvement. He introduced small rewards for completing tasks quickly. Some mild improvement, but the general trend continued. The workers were slowly withdrawing into themselves in a way that made them less and less functional. In 1825, several people died within a short span. None from obvious illness or injury. The Dr. Vance brought in from Charleston examined the survivors and the bodies and could find no clear medical cause. He wrote in his report, "These individuals appear to have died from what I can only describe as a failure of the will to live. Their bodies were functional, their organs showed no disease, but they seem to have simply stopped trying to continue. I have seen this occasionally in cases of profound melancholy, but never in multiple individuals at once. It suggests some environmental factor at Willowbrook that affects the balance of the mind. Vance was disturbed enough by this report to write to his brother for the first time in years. The correspondence from this period showed Vance trying to explain what was happening. In a letter from December 1825, he wrote, "I have created perfect obedience, but it appears there is a price. My people are dying not from disease or violence, but from something else, a kind of internal collapse. They are so thoroughly resigned that they have lost the basic instinct for survival. They work because Dutch tells them to work. They eat because food is provided. But they have no internal motivation, no spark of desire for anything, and in some cases, that absence of desire extends even to the desire to continue living. I do not know how to reverse this. I built a system to eliminate resistance. I did not realize I might also eliminate the vital force that keeps humans alive." His brother's response was short and cold. "You have reaped what you sowed, Thomas. I warned you years ago that your theories were dangerous. You treated human beings as mechanisms to be perfected. You have learned that humans cannot be perfected in this way without destroying what makes them human. I have no advice for you. I can only say that I am glad I did not follow your path." Vance was on his own. He spent the late 1820s trying desperately to find a way to preserve the system while restoring some basic functionality to the people trapped within it. He reduced the rules. He stopped using the pit entirely. It had not been used in over 3 years anyway. He tried to introduce small freedoms, tiny choices, anything that might spark some sense of agency. Nothing worked. The people at Willowbrook had been conditioned so thoroughly that they could not respond to freedom even when it was offered. They needed to be told what to do in every situation. Without instruction, they simply stood still and waited. The children born in the mid-1820s were even more profoundly affected. They grew up in an atmosphere of such complete silence and resignation that they seemed barely conscious. Vance noted in 1828, "The newest children do not speak at all, not because they cannot. They are physically capable, but because they never learned that speaking was possible or necessary. They watch the adults move in silence, and they imitate that silence. I attempted to encourage a child of about 5 to speak by offering rewards. The child looked at me without comprehension. It was as if the concept of voluntary speech did not exist in her mind." This was the ultimate failure of Vance's system. He had created conditions so oppressive that people adapted by essentially ceasing to be people. They became reactive mechanisms that worked when directed but had no internal life. And the children born into those conditions never developed internal lives at all. They were shaped from birth by an environment so devoid of agency, so absent of any possibility for choice, that they never learned the basic skills of being conscious individuals. The plantation continued to decline through the 1830s. Productivity fell year after year. More people died in that same mysterious way. No disease, no injury, just a gradual fading and then death. Vance brought in multiple doctors, trying to find a medical explanation. None could. The best explanation came from a physician from Charleston who spent 3 days at Willowbrook in 1831. After observing the property, he wrote to Vance, "I can find no physical ailment, but I believe the condition is psychological. Your people have been subjected to conditions that eliminate all hope, all agency, all possibility of self-determination for so long that their minds have in essence shut down. They are experiencing what some philosophers call a death of the soul that precedes death of the body. Once the soul has died, the body often follows, even if no physical disease is present. I do not know how to treat this condition. The only cure would be to restore hope and agency, but people who have lived without hope and agency for decades may have lost the capacity to recognize them, even if offered." Vance knew this was true. By the mid-1830s, he had accepted that his great experiment had failed in the long term. He had achieved perfect obedience, but he had discovered that perfect obedience was not compatible with sustained human function. The system had worked for decades, but it worked by slowly erasing the consciousness of everyone trapped within it. And once that erasure was complete, the system could not maintain itself because it required people to function as workers, and people who had been erased could no longer work effectively. In his final years, Vance became increasingly isolated. He had few visitors. He rarely left the property. He spent his time writing in his journals, documenting the decline, analyzing where his theories had failed. In an entry from 1838, just 2 years before his death, he wrote, "I set out to prove that proper conditions could create perfect compliance. I proved this. But I also proved that perfect compliance creates a different problem. Humans are not mechanisms. They cannot be perfected through control alone. They need some degree of agency, some spark of will, some reason to continue. I eliminated those things in pursuit of efficiency. I created a population of people who obeyed perfectly, but existed only as hollow shells. My system worked too well. It was effective beyond my expectations and destructive beyond my fears." He never expressed moral regret. Even in his final writings, he did not grapple with the ethics of what he had done to dozens of human beings. His regret was purely practical. He had failed to create the perpetually efficient system he had imagined. He had created something that functioned brilliantly for 2 decades, but contained the seeds of its own collapse. He wrote, "If I had calibrated differently, perhaps I could have found the balance point, enough control to prevent resistance, but enough freedom to maintain vitality. That balance point exists somewhere. I pushed past it, driven by the desire to prove that total compliance was possible. I proved it was possible. I did not prove it was sustainable." Thomas Vance died in March 1840 at age 75. He died alone in the main house at Willowbrook, with only Dutch present. His will specified that the property be sold and the proceeds distributed to distant relatives back in Maryland. The will also specified that all his journals and papers be preserved together. He wanted his work documented for posterity. Whether this was because he believed future generations would learn from his methods, or because he wanted a record of what he had achieved, is unclear. Perhaps he still believed his system had been a success despite its eventual decline. Or perhaps he wanted evidence to exist of what he had done, some accounting of the experiment he had conducted on human minds. The sale of Willowbrook took place in July 1840. The property was purchased by Robert Finch, a Charleston businessman who owned several plantations but had never visited Willowbrook before the purchase. Finch's letters and diary entries from this period provide an outsider's perspective on what Vance had created. Finch arrived at Willowbrook in August 1840, expecting to take over a functioning plantation. What he found horrified him. In a letter to the executor of Vance's estate dated August 10, 1840, Finch wrote, "I have arrived at Willowbrook, and I must immediately protest the condition in which this property was represented. I was told this was a functioning rice plantation with trained workers. What I have found is something altogether different and deeply disturbing. The fields are partially tended but far from productive. The quarters are standing but in a state of neglect. And the workers, who number 39 including children, are in a condition I struggle to describe. They are physically healthy for the most part, but mentally they appear absent. When I arrived, they were standing in silence in the courtyard. When I approached and addressed them, none responded. None made eye contact. None showed any awareness of my presence. The overseer, a man called Dutch, explained that they were waiting for morning assignments, but it was past 8 o'clock and work should have already begun. When I asked why they were not working, Dutch said they must first be told to work. He said they do nothing without explicit instruction. Finch spent several days at Willowbrook trying to understand what he had purchased. He quickly realized that the workers were not capable of normal function. They could perform tasks if given specific instructions, but they showed no initiative, no problem-solving ability, no capacity for independent action. If told to clear a field, they would clear it, but if they encountered a problem like a broken tool, they would simply stop and stand still until someone gave them new instructions. They did not speak to each other, except in the briefest possible exchanges necessary for coordinating work. They did not speak to Finch or Dutch, unless directly questioned. And even then, their responses were minimal and delivered in flat, emotionless tones. Most disturbing to Finch was their affect. In his diary entry from August 15, 1840, he wrote, "I have looked into their eyes, and I have seen nothing. No fear, no anger, no sadness, no hope, just emptiness. It is as if they are not entirely present in their own bodies. They move, they breathe, they perform work when directed, but there is no consciousness behind their actions. I have encountered many enslaved workers on my various properties. Some are defiant, some are resigned, some are broken by cruelty, but all of them, even the most damaged, show some spark of inner life. These people at Willowbrook show nothing. Whatever Mr. Vance did during his tenure here, he has created a population of human shells." Finch confronted Dutch about this. Dutch's explanation was brief. Mr. Vance had methods. He trained them to be obedient. This is the result. When Finch asked about those methods, Dutch showed him the pit in the center of the courtyard and explained its function. Finch was appalled. In his diary, he wrote, "Dutch showed me a device of torture that Mr. Vance used to enforce compliance. The cruelty of it is extraordinary, but what disturbs me more is that it has not been used in years, according to Dutch. It did not need to be used. The people here have been so thoroughly broken that the threat of punishment is no longer necessary. They have internalized their prison so completely that external enforcement is redundant." Finch tried to operate Willowbrook for 18 months. He replaced Dutch with a more traditional overseer who had experience on Finch's other plantations. He attempted to introduce normal working conditions. He tried to engage the workers, to spark some response, to find some way to restore basic functionality. Nothing worked. The decline that had begun in the late 1820s continued. Several more people died during Finch's tenure, including 3 children. The causes of death remained unclear. Physicians could find no disease. Finch wrote, "They seem to simply fade away. One day they are present, the next they are sitting motionless and will not eat or drink even when offered, and within days they are dead. It is as if they have decided collectively to cease existing." By early 1842, Finch had decided to abandon the plantation as a going concern. He had the rice fields harvested one final time, but the yield was poor and barely covered the costs. In February 1842, he made the decision to sell the workers separately and quickly. He took a significant financial loss, selling people far below market value just to be rid of them. In a letter to a business partner, he explained, "I cannot in good conscience keep them together, and I cannot continue trying to operate this cursed place. Whatever these people need, I cannot provide it. Perhaps if they are separated and moved to other plantations with normal conditions, some of them might recover. Or perhaps they are too damaged and will die regardless. But I will not keep them here. This property has a sickness to it that I do not understand and cannot cure." The people from Willowbrook were sold at auction in Charleston in March 1842. They went to various plantations across South Carolina and Georgia. Finch kept records of where each person went, perhaps out of some sense of responsibility, or perhaps simply for his own records. Those records survived and provide a fragmentary picture of what happened to the people who had been trapped at Willowbrook for so long. Most did not fare well. Their new owners quickly discovered that the workers from Willowbrook were damaged in ways that made them almost useless. They could perform simple, repetitive tasks if constantly supervised, but showed no capacity for anything requiring initiative or judgment. Several plantation owners who purchased people from Willowbrook wrote to Finch to complain. In one letter dated June 1842, a planter named Henry Dover wrote, "The man I purchased from you, listed in the sale as approximately 35 years old, is entirely unsuitable for plantation work. He stands motionless unless given explicit instruction. He will work if told to work, but the moment supervision is withdrawn, he stops and stares at nothing. He does not speak except to answer direct questions in the briefest possible way. He shows no personality, no emotion, no evidence of thought. I have owned slaves for 20 years, and I have never encountered anyone in this condition. I believe him to be simple-minded, though you represented him as sound. I am asking for a partial refund. Similar complaints came from other buyers. Finch responded to all of them with the same basic letter. I sold the people from Willowbrook as I found them. I made no specific representations about their mental condition. If you find them unsuitable, that is unfortunate, but sales are final. He never explained what had happened to those people, never mentioned Vance's system. Perhaps he thought no one would believe him. Perhaps he simply wanted to wash his hands of the entire situation. A few of the people from Willowbrook did show signs of recovery over time. These were primarily individuals who had been at Willowbrook for shorter periods, who had been purchased and brought there in the mid-1830s and thus had spent less time under the complete control of Vance's system. One woman named Rachel, who had been at Willowbrook for only 3 years before the dispersal, was sold to a plantation in Georgia. Her new owner, a man named Thomas Kinsey, wrote in his plantation diary about her gradual improvement. In an entry from October 1843, he noted, "The woman Rachel, who came from the Vance property, is slowly showing signs of personality. She has begun to speak more freely to the other women in the quarters. She occasionally smiles, which I had not seen before. She still has difficulty making decisions independently, but she is improving. It is as if she is relearning how to be a person." But these cases of recovery were rare. Most of the people from Willowbrook never recovered. They existed for months or years in their new locations, performing minimal work, showing no engagement with life, and eventually dying. The death rate among former Willowbrook workers was extraordinarily high. Within 5 years of the dispersal, more than half were dead, most from no identifiable cause beyond what physicians termed melancholy or failure to thrive. The children from Willowbrook fared worst of all. They had grown up in such a profoundly abnormal environment that they had never developed normal social or cognitive skills. When separated from the only environment they knew, even though that environment was deeply toxic, they could not adapt to new situations. Several of the children sold from Willowbrook died within months. Others survived but remained in a state of profound developmental damage for the rest of their lives. One child, a boy of about 7 years old at the time of the dispersal, was described by his new owner in 1845 as a creature who has the form of a child, but none of the capacities. He does not speak. He does not play. He does not interact with other children. He performs simple tasks if shown exactly what to do, but he learns nothing new. It is as if his mind stopped developing years ago and cannot be restarted. These accounts, scattered across various plantation records and personal diaries, provide a picture of the long-term damage caused by Vance's system. He had created conditions so psychologically oppressive that people were damaged permanently. Even when removed from those conditions, even when placed in environments that were comparatively less controlled, most could not recover. The psychological prison Vance had built continued to contain them even after the physical place no longer existed. The property itself stood empty for several years. Finch had no interest in returning to it and could find no buyer willing to take on the land given its reputation. Word had spread in the region about the strange conditions at Willowbrook, though no one understood the full extent of what Vance had done. The property was described as cursed or unlucky. Eventually, in 1847, the land was sold at a steep discount to a timber company that had no knowledge of its history. The buildings were demolished, the quarters torn down, the pit in the courtyard filled in, and the ground leveled. The new owners planted pine trees for timber harvesting. Within a decade, there was no visible evidence that Willowbrook had ever existed, but the documents survived. Vance's journals, his correspondence with his brother, his meticulous records of every aspect of his system. All of it was packed into a trunk by the executor of his estate and eventually donated to the Charleston Historical Society. The trunk was labeled simply Vance Plantation Records, 1797-1840, and stored in a warehouse. It sat there, unopened, for over a century. When researchers finally examined the contents in 1954, they were unprepared for what they found. The lead researcher, a historian named Margaret Denton, described the experience in a letter to a colleague. "We opened the trunk expecting routine plantation records. What we found was a detailed account of systematic psychological torture refined over decades. Vance documented everything: his theories, his methods, the mechanisms of control, the results. He wrote about destroying human minds as if he were describing agricultural techniques. It is the most disturbing collection of documents I have ever encountered. We are keeping them in restricted archives. I am not certain they should ever be published." The documents were indeed restricted. Over the following decades, only a handful of researchers were given access. Psychologists who studied them saw principles that would later be identified in research on learned helplessness and totalitarian control. Historians recognized elements that appeared in various systems of oppression throughout history, but no one wanted to publicize Vance's work too widely, fearing it could serve as a blueprint for future cruelty. In the 1970s, a psychology professor named Daniel Rosenthal wrote a paper based on the Willowbrook documents. The paper analyzed Vance's methods through the lens of modern psychological research. Rosenthal identified several principles that Vance had stumbled upon or deliberately discovered. The use of witnessed punishment to create collective responsibility, the elimination of privacy to prevent planning and hope, the use of absolute consistency to eliminate unpredictability that might allow for resistance, the calibration of punishment to be severe enough to be traumatic, but not so severe as to destroy the body's capacity for work. Rosenthal's paper concluded, Thomas Vance created what may be the most psychologically sophisticated system of control in the pre-modern era. He understood, whether through intuition or experimentation, how to imprison people not through physical restraint, but through psychological conditioning. His system worked brilliantly for 2 decades. Its eventual failure was not due to flaws in the psychological principles, but because he pushed those principles too far, discovering that there is a limit to how much the human mind can be compressed before it ceases to function entirely. The paper was published in a specialized academic journal and was read by very few people. Rosenthal received criticism from colleagues who felt he was giving too much attention to a system that should be forgotten. He responded, "We cannot forget what we do not understand. Vance's system is horrifying, but systems based on similar principles exist throughout history and into the present. Understanding how these systems work is not the same as condoning them. It is necessary if we are to recognize them and resist them." The documents remain in the Charleston Historical Society archives today. They are available to researchers who request them, though few do. The full collection has never been published. Most historians who learn about Willowbrook's story are disturbed enough by the summary that they have no desire to read the detailed documentation. But the documents exist, a testament to what one man did over 4 decades in pursuit of perfect control, and what that pursuit cost the people trapped in his experiment. The land where Willowbrook stood is now covered by commercial pine forests, and in some areas by suburban development. There is no marker, no historical sign, nothing to indicate what happened there. The people who live on that land today have no idea that their homes sit on ground where dozens of people were subjected to conditions designed to erase their consciousness, where a system of psychological imprisonment was perfected over decades, where people lived in silence so profound it might as well have been death. But the story survives in those documents, the careful records Vance kept, the letters he wrote, the journals where he documented his theories and observations and eventual doubts, the bills of sale and compliance ledgers and construction diagrams. All of it preserved, all of it waiting in archives for someone curious or brave enough to look directly at what humans are capable of doing to each other when they approach other humans as problems to be solved, rather than people to be treated as people. The question that haunts anyone who learns this story is how many other Willowbrooks existed. How many other men like Thomas Vance created similar systems and simply never documented them as thoroughly? How many plantations, prisons, workhouses, asylums, or other institutions discovered similar methods of psychological control and used them quietly, leaving no records for future generations to find? Vance was unusual in his need to document his work, in his belief that his methods represented progress that should be preserved. Most people who create systems of profound cruelty do not keep such detailed records. They act, and then the evidence fades, leaving only fragmentary accounts and scattered memories. And beyond the historical question is a present one. How many systems today operate on similar principles? Where people are controlled not through visible force, but through the manipulation of hope and fear and collective responsibility. Where privacy is eliminated and behavior is constantly surveilled. Where compliance is rewarded and resistance is met with consequences designed to traumatize entire communities. Where the cage exists not in walls, but in the careful destruction of the capacity to imagine that life could be different. These questions do not have easy answers, but they are the questions that the documents from Willowbrook force us to ask. Because Thomas Vance proved something terrible. That it is possible to imprison people so completely that they lose the ability to want escape, to imagine freedom, to remember they are human beings capable of choice. He proved that the cruelest prison has no walls, and he proved that such a prison can function efficiently for decades before the damage becomes so complete that the system collapses under the weight of what it has destroyed. That is what the documents explained. That is why no one ever tried to escape Willowbrook, and that knowledge, once gained, cannot be forgotten. It sits in archives, preserved in careful 19th-century handwriting, waiting to remind anyone who encounters it that the deepest forms of human cruelty are often the most methodical, the most systematic, the most hidden from casual view. Thomas Vance's legacy is not just what he did to the people trapped at Willowbrook. His legacy is the proof that such things are possible, that human will can be destroyed as thoroughly as any physical structure, and that the methods for doing so can be perfected, refined, and passed on to future generations who might choose to use them. The story ends where it began, with documents in a trunk, pages covered in neat handwriting, the detailed record of 4 decades spent perfecting the art of erasing human consciousness while leaving bodies intact. The people who suffered through those decades are long dead. The place where it happened has been erased from the landscape, but the knowledge remains, preserved in archives, a warning and a challenge. To recognize such systems when they arise, to resist them, and to remember that the worst prisons are the ones we cannot see because they exist entirely in the careful destruction of hope, agency, and the ability to imagine that anything could ever be different than it is.